What if I told you there's a Boros commander that makes your board scale completely out of control and allows you to gnome your opponents? Anim Pakal, Thousandth Moon. For 3 mana in my personal favorite color combination, we get a 1/2 human soldier that perfectly embodies what Boros aims to do, attacking and generating a crazy board state. Anim Pakal only has one very simple looking ability, but once you break it down, you'll see why this card gets out of control extremely fast. Whenever you attack with one or more non-Gnome creatures, 2 things will happen. Anim will get a +1/+1 counter, and then she will check how many counters she has and generate you that many tapped and attacking 1/1 Gnome artifact tokens. Now, while this ability is really straightforward, once you take a closer look, this ability is completely absurd. First of all, Anim doesn't even have to attack herself, which means that you can just keep Anim back safely on the battlefield and never get her into combat while still getting the payoff of her ability every single turn. And that alone already makes her incredibly consistent. Then we have the +1/+1 counter. Every time you attack, Anim will just keep growing. So instead of being a static token generator, she becomes a value engine that just keeps on scaling over the course of the game. And that matters for 2 different reasons. First of all, her body will scale into a tangible threat, meaning that commander damage is totally on the table. And the second reason is that these counters fuel the most important part of her ability, because the number of gnomes we'll be creating is equal to the amount of counters on Anim. So the first time you trigger her, you will get 1 gnome token, then 2, then 3, then 4, and this is usually where things start to get absolutely out of control. And the fact that these tokens enter the battlefield tapped and attacking is what really pushes this deck over the top. There's no setup required, no turn you have to wait. Whenever they enter the battlefield, they will start applying pressure immediately. And this is where the deck gets really interesting, because Anim doesn't lock you in a single way to close out the game. You can go tall by just growing Anim and winning the game on commander damage. You can go wide by just overwhelming the table with your army of gnomes, or you can use an impact tremors package to convert all of those gnomes entering the battlefield into non-combat damage and just burn down all your opponents at once. And the craziest part about this commander is that she doesn't need any help at all. As long as you just have one single creature to attack with, she will start taking over the game all by herself, which is exactly why protecting her at all times is this important. Because make no mistake, Anim Pakal is the single most important piece in this entire list. Now, because this commander is already really strong on her own, I decided to build this deck on a €100 budget. And honestly, it performs way better than you'd expect from a budget build. This deck can absolutely stomp some more expensive decks if they don't have any early interaction available to them. And if you're someone that doesn't care about budget lists and you just want high power decks, don't click away yet. Because at the end of this video, I included a detailed upgrade section where we will be pushing the power of this deck to its absolute limits. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 8 categories: the +1/+1 counter synergies, support, card draw, the win conditions, acceleration, protection and interaction, the lands, and like I mentioned, the upgrade section. And let's get started by talking about the +1/+1 counter synergies. These are the cards that will help us scale up Anim as quickly as possible, because the more counters we are able to stack on her, the more gnomes she will generate for us, and the quicker this deck will start scaling out of control. Guide of Souls, one of the craziest 1-drop creatures in existence. Whenever any other creature enters the battlefield under our control, we get to gain 1 life and 1 energy counter. Now, while this life gain ability might seem really cute, I can guarantee you with the huge amount of gnomes that Anim will be generating for us, it can get out of control really fast, which will make it really hard for your opponents to take you out of the game by using damage. And the energy counters we get only have one use in this deck, and that is this card's second ability. Whenever we attack while this creature is on the battlefield, battlefield, we get the option to pay 3 energy counters. When we do, we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target attacking creature and it will gain flying, which is just the perfect way to get additional counters onto your Anim, while also making sure she has evasion and she can't be blocked in combat. And this also sets up for some sort of a self-feeding loop, because Guide of Souls will put additional counters on Anim, Anim will generate you additional Gnomes, which then in turn will generate you a huge amount of additional life and energy counters you can use with your Guide of Souls. Luminarch Aspirant. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. Nothing fancy, just a really simple and solid ability that will help us scale up our commander. And the fact that this card is a 2-drop creature is actually really important in this deck, because you can just play this card on turn 2, follow up with your Anim on turn 3. Whenever you then go to combat, you can instantly put a counter onto Anim, then swing with this creature, and as early as turn 3 you will already have 2 counters on your Anim Pakal and start generating Gnome tokens immediately. Inti, Seneschal of the Sun. Whenever we attack with any creature, we get the option to discard a card. When we do, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on any attacking creature we control and it will gain trample until the end of turn. An ability that does give us the option to put additional counters onto our commander, and thanks to the trample, whenever she has a huge amount of power, we will always be able to get some commander damage through. And Inti's ability functions in exactly the same way as our commander. He will trigger whenever we attack with any creature, meaning we can just hold him back and make sure he never dies in combat. Now, while discarding a count for just a single counter might sound like a really bad deal, this is where Inti's second ability comes in. Whenever we discard any card, we get to exile the top card of our library and we get the ability to play it until the end of turn, which means we won't actually be creating a card disadvantage for ourselves, while at the same time also allowing us to just discard any useless card we don't need and get the option to dig 1 card deeper into our library. Noble Heritage, a legendary enchantment background, and just like all of the other backgrounds, it will give our commander an additional ability. Whenever this creature enters the battlefield or at the beginning of your upkeep, each player will get the option to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control, and for each opponent who takes the 2 counter deal, we will gain protection from that player until our next turn. Now, first up, any sort of background is just perfect for any deck that plans to have its commander on the battlefield 100% of the time, giving ourselves the benefit that we do get 2 additional counters and 2 additional Gnome tokens from Anim every single turn, and thanks to Discard's effect reading that whenever this creature enters the battlefield, it will generate you some immediate value once you drop Anim on turn 3. Now, usually in my experience, your opponents won't ever be taking the 2 counters, because getting protection from a player is actually a quite potent defensive effect. If they decide to swing at you with any creature, you won't be taking any damage, and if you are playing against a Storm player who is trying to resolve their 100 copies of Grapeshot, they just won't be able to target you. Arcade Cabinet, a new artifact we got in the Teenage Mutant Ninja set that whenever it enters the battlefield allows us to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 4 different creatures. An effect you can use to both buff up your Anim or any other creature you already have on the battlefield, but the main reason this card is included is its activated ability. For 2 mana and sacrificing a token, we get to double the amount of counters on any target creature, and this ability just goes absolutely crazy when combined with our commander, because now instead of just having 4 counters and generating you 4 Gnomes, before you swing you can just activate this simple artifact. She will go up to 8 counters and you will get to generate 8 Gnomes. And keep in mind, this is an effect you can use over and over again every single turn. If your opponents have no way to deal with this artifact or your commander, you will just win the game by either swinging with your huge Anim Pakal or by generating a gazillion Gnome tokens. And the fact that you do have to sacrifice a token to activate the ability in this deck doesn't really matter, because we will always have Gnomes available to use as sacrifice fodder. Orzhov Advocist, a creature with an ability that is really similar to a Noble Heritage. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player gets the option to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto a creature they control. And if an opponent does take the 2 counter deal, all creatures they control won't be able to attack you until your next turn, making it into a card that will both up our token production thanks to the additional counters, while also giving you access to a really solid optional defensive layer. Rosy Cotton of South Lane, a card that everyone knows from the infamous 2-card infinite combo with Basking Broodscale. And even though we can't play that card in this deck, Rosy is arguably as broken. Whenever we create any token with Rosy on the battlefield, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. And since this card doesn't say one or more, we will get 1 counter for each token. Now you probably already know where I'm going with this. Let's say you attack with your Anim Pakal and you do have 3 counters on her. She will then generate you 3 tapped and attacking Gnome tokens, and whenever you then have your Rosy on the battlefield, you will get to put 3 additional counters on your commander, which will set you up for some incredible value on your next turn when you are able to swing with her again. And since whenever Rosy enters the battlefield she generates you a food token, she does provide you with some immediate value, instantly allowing you to put a +1/+1 counter on your commander. And a card with basically the exact same effect is a new uncommon card we got in the Teenage Mutant Ninja set, Mighty Mutanimals. Just like Rosy, whenever any creature enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. That, just like I explained, synergizes perfectly with all of the gnomes that Anim will be generating for us, which this card will then convert into a huge amount of +1/+1 counters onto your commander, making her generate even more gnome tokens on your next turn and making this card generate you even more +1/+1 counters. And this card also enters with its own 2/2 mutant token, allowing you to instantly start the counter stacking process. Next up, we have the support section. These are the cards that really push the engine of this deck over the top. Whether it's us getting additional combat steps, generating us additional tokens, or improving our combat steps, these cards make the deck incredibly consistent. And let's start this section off with what is arguably the best card in the entire deck. Reconnaissance, a 1 mana enchantment with an activated ability we can use for 0 mana, which will allow us to remove any attacking creature we control from combat and untap it. Now, while this ability is worded in a really weird way, let me just explain to you how potent it can be. Let's say you go to combat and you want to attack with one of your creatures to get an Anim trigger. You then declare your attackers and you will get the +1/+1 counter and the gnome production. Then you go to the declare blocker step, and let's say an opponent declares a blocker that would destroy your creature in combat. You can then just activate your Reconnaissance on instant speed for free and just remove that creature from combat and untap it, which essentially means for as long as you have this enchantment on the battlefield, you can just swing with your entire board, and whenever anything would die in combat, you can just remove it from combat instead and everything will always survive. And this card's effect doesn't even stop there, because it also gives all of your creatures some sort of pseudo vigilance. You can just swing with your entire board, and even after combat damage has been dealt, you do get a small window of opportunity to activate Reconnaissance, just enabling you to untap all of their creatures and still get any sort of combat damage through, which will make sure you will always have blockers available. This card really is an auto-inclusion in any sort of combat-based deck. Great Train Heist, an instant speed spell with the spree mechanic, meaning whenever you cast it, you get to pay the cost of any of its additional modes, and all of those modes will activate. For 3 mana, you get to untap all creatures you control, and you will get an additional combat phase after this one, which means you will get to attack again with all of the gnomes that you just generated with Anim, while also giving you an additional Anim trigger, which will generate you a batch of new gnome tokens tapped and attacking that will instantly deal damage. The second mode for 2 mana will give all of your creatures a +1 power boost and first strike until the end of turn, which in this type of deck will essentially double all of the combat damage you deal by doubling our gnome's power. And the final and probably the best part of this card will for 1 mana make you choose an opponent. Whenever any creature does deal combat damage to the chosen player, you will get to generate a tapped treasure token. And due to the way of how this ability is worded, it will work with the tapped and attacking gnome tokens, because you don't actually have to declare any of these creatures as attackers, they just have to deal combat damage. And as you can imagine, this ability will just generate you a gazillion treasure tokens, and mana won't ever be an issue anymore. And the best part about the spree cards is that you can pick multiple modes at once. Just imagine activating both the first and the third ability on this card. You will swing with Anim and all of her tapped and attacking gnomes, and you get to generate a huge amount of treasures. Then you get to untap everything, swing again with even more gnomes, and you will get even more treasures. Kin Scare Sentry, a really good new addition we got in the Lorwyn set for any sort of go white token deck. Whenever this creature attacks, we get to put any creature card from our hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking with mana value X or less, X being the total amount of attacking creatures. And this card doesn't actually care about the amount of creatures you declared as actual attackers. It only cares about the amount of current attacking creatures, which is just perfect with all of the gnome tokens that will be entering tapped and attacking. And this little dude can set you up for some insane tempo plays, because let's say you have Anim on the battlefield with just 2 counters on her, and then you attack with this creature. You will then get both attack triggers on the stack, and you decide how you want to resolve them. Let's say you resolve the Anim trigger first, which will give her a counter and generate you 3 tapped and attacking gnome tokens, and then whenever this card's ability does resolve, it will see a total of 4 attacking creatures, which then in turn will allow you to cheat a 4-drop creature into play for absolutely free. Firebender Ascension, a new card we got in the Avatar set, which is just the perfect addition for any sort of Boros or Mordu combat-based deck. Whenever it enters a battlefield, we get to generate a 2/2 soldier token with Firebending 1. Now the fact that this enchantment does enter with its own token on turn 2 is incredibly potent in this deck, because it will give us a body to swing with on turn 3 when Anim comes down. Now where the real money's at is its second ability. Whenever a creature we control attacking would cause an ability of a permanent to trigger, it will get a quest counter. Then if this card has 4 or more quest counters, that ability will trigger an additional time. And this card is basically the 2 mana enchantment version of Ishin, because with all of the attack triggers we are playing in this deck, it is incredibly easy to get this card online by having 4 quest counters. Because even just as early as turn 3, whenever you do attack with the Firebending token that this card generates, you will already get 2 counters on it. One from the Firebending and one from Anim's ability. And once this card is online, it will generate some absurd value. We will be able to use the ability of our Guide of Souls a second time. It will double Inti's discard trigger. It will double up on the effect of the previous card, allowing us to cheat 2 creatures into play. And most importantly, it will double up on our commander's trigger, both giving her an additional counter and generating an additional batch of gnomes. And as you will see later in the video, we do have a ton more cards in the deck that just synergize perfectly with this effect. Loyal Apprentice, a simple 2-drop creature we can use on turn 3 to instantly start generating gnomes with Anim, and on top of that it also has the Lieutenant ability, meaning at the beginning of combat on our turn, if we do control our commander, which is the entire game plan of this deck, we get to generate a 1/1 top tier token with flying, and it will gain haste until the end of turn, always guaranteeing us we have an evasive body on the battlefield we can swing with to get an Anim trigger, while also just growing our board state and giving us an additional creature entering the battlefield for any of our win conditions you will see later. Adept Water Shaper, a merfolk with a really simple yet really potent ability. All other tapped creatures you control will gain indestructible, basically allowing you to turn your entire board sideways and never having to worry about them being destroyed in combat. And this ability also helps us deal with the biggest weakness of this deck, board wipes. Since most board wipe spells do have the restriction that they have to be cast on sorcery speed, you can just attack with all of your creatures, and then whenever an opponent is trying to reset the board by using a board wipe during their own turn, the only creature that will be destroyed is this merfolk, and the rest of your board will just survive. Kirill, Attentive First Year. By tapping 2 untapped creatures you control, you get to pick any triggered ability on the stack and you get to copy copy it. The downside being that you can use this effect only once per turn. Now obviously the main thing we'll be using this for is to copy Anim's ability. Let's say you have Anim on the battlefield with 3 counters on her and then you decide to swing with her. Her trigger will then go on the stack and then you can just tap your keyroll and any other untapped creature you control to get a copy of that ability. The first one will then resolve, give her an additional counter and generate you 4 Gnome tokens, and then the second copy will also resolve, giving her an additional counter and generating you 5 Gnome tokens. And this ability can be used on many different triggered abilities in this deck. You can get additional counters with your Noble Heritage, an additional use of your Guide of Souls ability, cheat an additional creature into play with your Kinscare Sentry, and there are many more interactions you will see later in the video. Raph and Leo, sibling rivals, a 3-mana mutant ninja turtle. I see what you did there. Whenever this creature attacks, if it is the first combat phase of the turn, we get to untap up to 2 different creatures and we will get an additional combat phase after this one. And as you can imagine, additional combat steps in this deck are just fantastic. Since the more we are able to attack, the more counters we'll get on Anim, the more tapped and attacking gnomes we will generate, and the faster this deck will scale out of control. And these turtles are simply one of the most straightforward ways to get access to those additional combat phases. You don't even have to do anything special, just attack with them and Bob's your uncle. Renewed Solidarity. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, we have to choose a creature type. Now obviously we will be choosing gnomes. And passively all creatures of the chosen type will get a +1 power boost, doubling the amount of damage that all of our gnomes will deal. And the craziest part of this enchantment is its second passive effect. At the beginning of our end step, for each creature token of the chosen type that entered the battlefield under our control this turn, we do get to create a token copy of it, essentially just doubling up on the amount of gnomes we did produce that turn, which will give us a huge token army to swing with on our next turn. It will give us a huge amount of ETB triggers for any of our group slug effects, and keep in mind, thanks to this card's first ability, all of the additional gnomes you generate will have double the power. Gogo, Mysterious Mime. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we get the option to turn Gogo into a copy of any creature we have on the battlefield, except its name will still remain Gogo, allowing us to copy any legendary creature without them dying to the legend rule. And when we do decide to go for the copy, it will give both Gogo and the targeted creature a +2 power boost and haste until the end of turn. Now obviously the main target for this ability will be our commander, which sadly when copied by Gogo he will only count the counters he has on himself. So even though you do get an additional copy of your commander, you will have to slowly start stacking counters onto Gogo. But any additional gnome we are able to generate is very welcome and your opponents will have to deal with him at some point. And there are some other fantastic targets you can copy with your Gogo. You can turn him into a copy of your Rosy Cotton or your Mighty Mutanimals to just get a ton of additional +1/+1 counters, or you can even turn him into any of our win-con creatures you will see in a later section. And Gogo also functions as a fantastic haste enabler, because the turn he comes down he will give himself haste by copying something, and if he's already on the battlefield and you play a big win-con creature, you can just copy it with Gogo and the creature you just played will also gain haste. Next up we have the section that covers the biggest weakness of any sort of Boros deck, card draw. Since we are playing a deck with a really low curve, it is really easy to empty our hand and we do need ways to keep the engine going. These cards will help us refill our hand, dig deep into our deck to find key pieces, and will make sure we never run out of gas and we can just keep the pressure on. Skull Clamp, by far the best card draw engine for any sort of token deck. It's a 1-mana equipment you can equip for 1 mana that will give the equipped creature +1 power and -1 toughness. And whenever the equipped creature would die, you get to draw 2 cards. Now thanks to our commander generating us a gazillion 1/1 gnome tokens, we will always have targets to Skull Clamp, essentially making this card read: pay 1 generic mana, sacrifice 1 of your gnomes, and you will get to draw 2 cards in return. And for example, in the late game, if you just have 3 spare gnomes on the battlefield, a Skull Clamp will give you the option to just pay 3 generic mana to draw a massive amount of 6 cards, which will instantly allow you to refuel your entire entire hand. Glimmerlance, a 2-mana equipment that has the 4 Mirrodin mechanic, meaning whenever it enters a battlefield we get to create a 2/2 rebel token and instantly attach this equipment to it, which already makes it function as a 2-drop creature we can use to start triggering Anim as early as turn 3. And on top of that, whenever the equipped creature does attack together with at least one other creature, we get to draw a card. And since we are a combat focused creature heavy deck, we will always be swinging with at least 2 creatures, which this card will then translate into 1 additional card being drawn every single turn. Staff of the Storyteller, an artifact that will enter the battlefield accompanied by a 1/1 flying spirit token, already making sure we have an evasive creature body to swing with by the time Anim comes down, and also instantly triggering this card's second ability. Whenever 1 or more creature tokens would be created under our control, we get to put a story counter onto this card, which we can then remove for 1 mana and tapping it to just draw a card. And since the entire goal of this deck is to create Gnome tokens every single turn, this is essentially another artifact that will give us 1 additional card every single one of our turns. And now let's get into some draw engines that will just draw us additional cards for doing what this deck does best. Creating Gnomes. Welcoming Vampire, a 3-mana flying creature that whenever any amount of creatures with power 2 or less would enter the battlefield under our control will reward us with a free card. Sadly, this ability only triggers once per turn and we don't really have ways to generate tokens during our opponent's turns. And a card that has exactly the same function is Tokasia's Welcome. Whenever any amount of creatures with mana value 3 or less enter the battlefield, we get to draw a card, which will automatically trigger whenever we do have Anim on the battlefield and we do attack. And since this effect is on an enchantment and not a creature body like a Welcoming Vampire, it is a ton harder to deal with for your opponents. Another really similar card that is even harder to deal with is an Enduring Innocence, a 3-mana enchantment creature that has exactly the same effect as a Welcoming Vampire, and whenever this creature would be destroyed, it just returns to the battlefield as an enchantment, essentially forcing your opponents to use 2 removal spells of this, making it really hard to ever get off the board. And a new addition we got in the Edge of Eternity set is Halia, Guided by Light. Whenever Halia or any other creature or artifact we controls enters the battlefield, we get to gain 1 life, which just like Guide of Souls will turn our massive Gnome production into a bunch of life gain, and at the beginning of our end step she will check if we gain 3 or more life this turn, and when we did we get to draw a card. Now usually by the time this card does come down we will have enough counters on our Anim to generate at least 3 Gnomes per turn, which will then draw us 1 additional card per turn. Now on top of already giving us fantastic value for 3 mana, she also has the Warp ability for just 1 white mana, which means you can just cast it for 1, but at the end of your turn you do have to exile it, and then you can just cast it straight from exile on a later turn, basically allowing you whenever you do just have 1 mana left, you can just squeeze in your Halia for 1 mana, generate some Gnomes with your commander, and you will get to draw a card of it. Mentor of the Meek, a classic card that just feels like it was made for this deck. Whenever any creature with power 2 or less enters a battlefield under your control, you get the option to pay 1 generic mana to draw a card, which unlike all of the previous cards doesn't have the once per turn restriction. So whenever you now attack with your Anim and generate 3 Gnome tokens, you can draw 3 cards for just 3 generic mana, which in the late game is just a fantastic way to refill your entire hand. Lochiel, Clockwork Scholar, a 3-mana elephant that will passively prevent all damage being dealt to any attacking artifact creature you might control, which essentially means you won't be losing any of your tapped and attacking Gnome creatures to them being blocked in combat. And the reason why this card is in the card draw section is that whenever any artifact creature enters a battlefield under your control, you will get to draw a card. Just like the other cards in this section, a really solid yet really efficient effect. And the last card in this section is a Light Up the Stage. Now unlike all of the other cards, this isn't a card draw engine, but instead it is a one-time effect. For 3 mana you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library and you are allowed to play them until the end of your next turn. And the next turn part on this card is what makes it incredibly good, because you don't even have to cast the exiled cards immediately. They will still be available to cast from exile on your next turn. Now honestly, paying 3 mana for this type of effect isn't all that great of a deal. A good thing that this card also has the spectacle mechanic, meaning whenever an opponent did lose life this turn, you can cast it for 1 mana instead. Now as you can imagine, with all of the tapped and attacking gnomes we'll be generating, we will always be able to make an opponent just lose 1 life, allowing you to cast this card in your second main phase, and you will have 2 additional cards available to cast on your next turn. Now before we get into the cards we actually win the game with, if you like these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. All members will get early access to the deck lists, exclusive member chat rooms in the Discord where I'm always sharing what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. Seeing more and more people supporting me through the membership program has been absolutely incredible, and thanks to you I can keep pouring all of my love and passion for Magic into these weekly deck tech videos. And speaking of support, if you're building any of my decks and you have to sleeve them up, you can now head over to the Dragon Shield website and use the code PANZER to get 5% off your order. So if you were about to buy sleeves anyways, you might as well save a little bit of money and support your favorite content creator in the process. Sounds like a win-win situation if you ask me. Next up, we have our win conditions. Once Anim is online and producing us a huge amount of gnomes, we do need ways to actually close out the game. These cards will either buff up our gnomes, convert all of them into table-wide burn damage, and just allow us to close out the game on the spot without your opponents ever being ready. Arabella, Abandoned Doll. Whenever this artifact creature attacks, we get to deal X damage to each opponent and we get to gain X life. X being the total amount of creatures we control with power 2 or less. And this creepy looking doll has one of the most brutal attack triggers ever printed because the damage is being dealt to each opponent. And this ability goes absolutely nuclear when you combine it with the gnomes that Anim will be generating for us. Since you can just stack the triggers however you'd like, you can just attack with your Arabella, you will get both the trigger out of this card and your Anim, you can choose to produce the gnome tokens first, and they will then count towards Arabella's ability and chunk a huge amount of damage out of your opponent's life totals. And just imagine this ability triggering with 10 creatures on the battlefield and you being able to copy it with your Kirill on the battlefield. And a fun behind the scenes fact is that whenever I was doing research into a Boros token deck, it was really close between Arabella or Anim as a commander for this deck. Now while Arabella does come down 1 turn earlier and she does have a really crazy win con ability, she really doesn't do all that much by herself and you do need to play a ton of token generation. And the fact that she also is an artifact makes it really easy for your opponents to just Vandal Blast her off the board. While Anim is the token generator herself, she doesn't need any other cards to take over the game, and most importantly, I really don't want to be looking at a creepy doll sitting in my command zone. And now let's dive into our group slug package. Let's get started with a classic, Impact Tremors, a 2-mana enchantment that whenever any creature enters a battlefield under your control will deal 1 damage to each opponent. So now on top of Anim generating us a crazy board state of attacking gnome tokens that will deal a huge amount of combat damage, for each gnome we generate we will now also get to burn down the entire table with non-combat damage. And trust me, whenever the ball is rolling and you have a couple of counters on Anim, these effects get absolutely crazy. In the late game, if you do have Anim on the battlefield with 5 counters on her, you can just drop an Impact Tremors effect, swing with her, generate 6 stepped and attacking gnome tokens, and you will get to burn down each opponent for 6 damage, equaling in a total of 18 damage being dealt for just doing what you were about to do anyways in this deck. Group slug effects like these will give us an additional layer of non-combat damage that even allow us to win the game if our opponents have a really solid board state they can block our gnomes with. A Gate Instigator, a creature with exactly the same effect as an Impact Tremors. And the fact that this time we get it on a 2-drop creature makes it even better because we will be able to drop Anim on turn 3 and instantly get a trigger by attacking with this. On top of that, this card also has the Offspring mechanic, meaning whenever we cast it we get the option to pay 2 additional mana and it will enter with a 1/1 token copy of itself with exactly the same ability. So whenever you draw into this card in the late game and you do have the mana available, you will get 2 impact tremors effects on just one card, which will just deal an absurd amount of damage, because whenever you now generate 5 Gnome tokens, you will get to deal 10 damage to each opponent. Reckless Fire Weaver, which unlike the previous cards won't trigger whenever a creature enters, but whenever an artifact enters, which will still trigger off all the Gnomes we produce since they are artifact creature tokens. If you for example cast a Great Train Heist and connect with 5 Gnome tokens generating you 5 treasures, it will also trigger and deal 5 damage to each opponent. Molten Gatekeeper, another 3 mana impact tremors effect on an artifact creature body, but this time it also has the unearth mechanic, meaning whenever it is in your graveyard, either due to being removed or being milled, you can just pay 1 red mana. It will then return to the battlefield with haste and has to be sacrificed at the end of turn. So if you know you are about to go for a swing with your Anim with a huge amount of counters on her, just unearth this card first, and you will get to deal a huge amount of additional damage for just 1 mana. Weft Stalker Ardent, another group slug card that will trigger whenever any creature or artifact enters, and the best part about this card is that just like Halia, this card has the warp mechanic for just 1 red mana, meaning you can just tap all of your lands but 1, get some huge value creatures into play, then before you get to combat just pay the 1 red mana, get this card on the field, swing with your commander and generate a bunch of Gnomes dealing a huge amount of damage, and then on a later turn before you swing again with Anim, you can just cast this card again from exile, a recently released card that is just the perfect addition for any sort of token generating deck. War Leader Skull, another card that has exactly the same effect as an impact tremors, but in return for paying 1 additional mana, it will also give all creatures we control a passive +1/+1 stat boost, both giving us that non-combat damage for generating Gnome tokens, while also doubling them in size and allowing us to deal double the amount of actual combat damage with them. And the last and the most basic group slugger in this deck is a Witty Roastmaster, just a simple solid impact tremors effect attached to a 3 mana creature body. Now this card is the least efficient of the bunch and is mainly included for budget reasons, and I do have some great upgrades in the upgrade section. But still, the more of these group slug effects we can have on the battlefield at the same time, the easier it will be for us to close out the game. Devilish Valet, a 3-drop trample haste creature that has an ability that will actually require you to use a calculator. Whenever any other creature enters a battlefield under your control, you get to double this card's power. And yes, this effect does scale with each individual Gnome you generate. It will go to 2 power, 4, 16, 32, 64, and if you are able to generate enough creature tokens, it can easily go over 1 million power. And there is actually a formula you can use to calculate this creature's power. I will flash it and some of the results into the screen. And thanks to this card having haste, it has an immediate impact whenever you swing with it with Anim on the battlefield. And if this creature does get to 1 million power, thanks to the trample, your opponents can just block it with a 1/1 squirrel token. It's honestly one of the most fun effects in the entire deck, and I was able to generate some absolutely crazy numbers with it. Feel free to let me know in the comments below what is the highest amount of power you ever saw this creature at. Sentinel Sarah Leons, a 5 mana haste body that for as long as an artifact enter the battlefield under your control, this turn will give all creatures you control a +2/+2 stat boost. And this anthem effect just works wonders when combined with Anim's ability, because whenever you attack, you will always be guaranteeing you have at least 1 Gnome token enters the battlefield under your control, unlocking the stat boost. And in the late game, whenever you for example generate 5 Gnomes with your Anim Pakal, thanks to their stats being boosted, you will get a total of 15 power and 15 toughness entering the battlefield. Now just that ability alone is already more than enough reason to include this card in the deck. But on top of that, she also has a battalion ability. Whenever she attacks with at least 2 other creatures under your control, you get to ping damage to target opponents equal to the amount of artifacts you do control. Now first up, this ability doesn't work with any of the gnomes that Anim will generate you, because to trigger a battalion ability you actually have to declare attackers with those creatures, and the gnomes already enter tapped and attacking. Now that being said, since we are a creature heavy deck, you will always have 2 other creatures available to swing with. And with the huge amount of gnomes we'll be controlling, this ability can easily deal like 20, 30, 40 damage to a single opponent and just instantly take them out of the game. And thanks to this card having haste, it will have an immediate impact, and usually your opponents will never ever see this coming. Qatar's Crusade. Whenever any creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on your entire board. Now first up, the amount of stats that this simple card will give you when combined with Anim is just crazy. Just generate 4 gnome tokens, they will already enter the battlefield with 4 counters on them. The rest of your board will also gain those 4 counters, and the most important part is that you also get to put 3 counters onto Anim, which will just feed into itself because you will be able to generate even more gnomes on your next turn and get even more counters of this card. And the stat boost your entire board will get isn't just a one-time thing. The counters do stay on them permanently. Divine Visitation. Whenever this enchantment is on the battlefield and any amount of creature tokens would be created under your control, you get to generate that many 4/4 flying vigilance tokens instead. And this is honestly one of my favorite cards to use in this deck, because now instead of generating you these rubbish 1/1 artifact gnome tokens, Anim will now generate you tapped and attacking 4/4 flying angel tokens, quadrupling all of the stats of our tokens and also giving them evasion. And this card also has a nice synergy with any other token generator in the deck. For example, the top tier token that our loyal apprentice will generate us every single turn. And there's one more group slug card we are playing in the deck, Reptile Rampager, which instead of dealing just 1 damage whenever a creature enters, will deal 2 damage to each opponent instead. And usually by the time this creature does come down, you will already have like 3, 4, 5 counters on your Anim, and whenever you then swing with her, you will be dealing huge amounts of damage to your opponent's life totals. And if Slash does stick around on the battlefield, whenever you attack with him, he will also generate you a 2/2 creature token, triggering his own ability. And the last card in this section is Dollmaker's Shop and Porcelain Gallery, one of the room cards from the Duskborn set. The left side of this card is a 2-mana enchantment that whenever you attack a player will generate you a 1/1 toy token, which I suppose is a nice way to get additional tokens on the board and extra group slug triggers. And due to the way of how this card is worded, if you actually attack 3 different opponents in one single combat step, you will get 3 tokens instead. Pretty good value for just a 2-mana enchantment. Now the reason why this card is in the win condition section is the right side of this card, Porcelain Gallery. Whenever you pay 6 mana to unlock this door, all creatures you control will have base power and toughness equal to the total amount of creatures you do control. And this is honestly one of the best stat boosting effects in existence for any sort of token deck, because it is an ability that will constantly change in numbers over the course of the game depending on the creatures you control, and every time you attack with your Anim you will just get to add more gnome tokens and all of your creature stats will just go up. And due to this ability changing the base stats of a creature, it makes it even better with +1/+1 counters. Because first the base stat change does apply, and then you will get additional stats from any counters your creatures might have. Next up we have a really small acceleration section. Now while this deck doesn't really need any acceleration whatsoever, the more mana we have access to in the mid and the late game, the easier it will be to deploy all of our value cards. Goldmere, Ironmere and Ornithopter of Paradise. All of these 2-drop creatures have exactly the same effect, and it is that you can tap them to add 1 mana to your mana pool. Now while this deck doesn't need to run any acceleration, you can play all of these creatures on turn 2 and you will be able to swing with them on turn 3 when Anim is on the battlefield and kickstart the +1 and gnome generating process. While then on a later turn you can just tap them for mana and use it to get out any of your high mana cost value cards. Knight of the White Orchid, a 2 mana first strike creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will check if any opponent controls more lands than you do. If that is the case, you get to search your library for a plains card and put it onto the battlefield untapped. Now, since we are a Boros deck and we don't have any means to accelerate our lands, we will always control less lands than our opponents do who are playing things like a Farseek. And even if that isn't the case, if you play this on turn 2 and you aren't the starting player and no one has missed a land drop, you will always get to trigger this card's effect, both filtering your deck and accelerating your mana. Scuzzback Scrounger, a 2-drop creature that at the beginning of our first main phase will allow us to blight 1, meaning we have to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 creature we control. And when we do so, we get to generate an untapped treasure token. Now, usually the first time this triggers is on turn 3 and you can just decide to put a -1/-1 counter on itself and generate you that treasure. But on the later turns in the game, we will always have a huge amount of gnomes to our disposal, which then essentially will allow us to convert 1 gnome per turn into a free treasure token, which is a deal you always want to take. And of course, we're also playing a professional phase breaker. Whenever 1 or more creatures do deal combat damage to an opponent, we get to generate a treasure token. And this ability is just incredibly easy to trigger with our tapped and attacking gnomes. And a fun fact, due to the way of how this ability is worded, if you for example swing 3 gnomes at one specific opponent, you will only get 1 treasure token, but if you swing all 3 of those gnomes targeted at different opponents and all of them do connect, you will instead get 3 treasures. And whenever you do create attacking gnomes with Anim, you actually get to pick which players they are going to swing at, making it incredibly solid with this ability. Now, on top of being a really excellent acceleration tool, it also has another ability, which allows us to sacrifice a treasure token to exile the top card of our library, and we are allowed to play it until the end of turn, which in the late game, whenever you already have a huge amount of mana available, will allow you to dig really deep into your deck by sacrificing your treasures, and you can just go look for the card you need most at the current given board state. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. Since our commander is the most important piece in this entire deck, keeping her on the battlefield for as long as possible is really crucial to our strategy. These cards help us protect our board, disrupt whatever our opponents are doing, and just keep our entire game plan intact. Benevolent Bodyguard, a 1-drop creature we can sacrifice to give any other creature protection of a specific color until the end of turn. Now, the main reason I decided to go with creature-based protection spells is the fact that we can just drop them really early in the game, and we can use them as bodies to swing with on the turn that Anim comes down. And later in the game, whenever you don't need the body anymore, whenever any opponent is now casting a spot removal spell like a Path to Exile at your Anim, you can just sacrifice this body on instant speed and she will always survive. And a card with a really similar effect is Zack Fair, a 1-drop creature that will enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on himself, and by paying 1 generic mana and sacrificing it, we get to give target creature indestructible until the end of turn and move any sort of +1/+1 counters on Zack to that creature. Another body we can swing with to trigger Anim, a protection tool for our commander to prevent her from being destroyed, while also giving us a way to get an additional counter on Anim and produce more gnomes. Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. Both cards are 1 mana instant speed spells that will allow us to exile any creature on the board on instant speed. The controller of that creature will get to gain some life or get a basic land into play, but usually that doesn't matter. These are simply some of the most efficient removal spells in existence, and there's really no reason not to play them in the deck. Requisition Rate, another card with the spree mechanic. The first option will allow you to destroy an artifact, the second one an enchantment, and the third option will allow you to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, both giving us a way to deal with any problematic cards like a Phyrexian Altar or an Aura Shards on the battlefield, while the last ability will buff up our entire board of gnomes and double their power, while also putting an additional counter on Anim and just allowing her to create more gnomes. And like I mentioned with Great Train Heist, the best part about the spree mechanic is that you get the ability to pick all of the options on the card at once. Duty Beyond That, in my opinion, one of the most underrated cards we got in recent Magic sets. It's a 2 mana spell that as an additional cost will require you to sacrifice a creature, and in return all other creatures you control will gain indestructible until the end of turn, and you do get to put a +1/+1 counter on all of them, both functioning as a way to protect your commander and your entire board from being wiped, while at the same time you can also use it as an offensive option to just get a huge amount of damage or buff up your Anim. Bulwark Ox, a 2-mana creature with the Saddle 1 mechanic, meaning on sorcery speed we can tap any creature we control with power 1 or greater to get this creature saddled. And whenever this creature attacks while it's saddled, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on any creature we control. And this card just provides some incredible tempo on turn 2. You can just play this, follow up with Anim on turn 3, then still during your main phase you can just tap Anim to get this creature settled. You can attack with your Bulwark Ox, you can stack the triggers however you like, and you first decide to put a +1/+1 counter on Anim, then Anim's trigger will resolve and you will instantly get 2 Gnome tokens. And on top of being a really great way to get additional counters on our commander, he also has an activated ability, which allows us to sacrifice this creature to give all creatures who we control with counters on them hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, which is just the perfect way to protect Anim because she will always have counters on her due to her own ability, and if you just cast a Requisition Raid and got a +1/+1 counter on your entire board, this is a perfect mass protection effect. Grand Crescendo. For 2 white mana plus X we get to generate X 1/1 green and white citizen tokens. Then after those tokens have been generated, all creatures we control will gain indestructible until the end of turn. Now baseline you can cast the spell for just 2 mana to give your entire board indestructible and protect it from being wiped. While in the late game also functioning as a spell you can dump all of your leftover mana into, which then will generate you a huge amount of tokens and trigger all of your Impact Tremors Group Slug cards. Razorgrass Ambush, a 2 mana instant speed spell that will deal 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. And this is an incredibly fun card to use in this deck, because whenever you are swinging your 1/1 gnomes at your opponents, they will usually be using their value creatures or their commanders as jump blockers because they only deal 1 damage anyways. But once they did declare their creature as a blocker, you can then just follow up with a Razorgrass Ambush and remove any creature with 4 total toughness. And if you don't need this effect, you can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for a white mana and even enters the battlefield untapped for the low cost of 3 life. Selfless Spirit, the 2 mana flying and improved version of a benevolent bodyguard, because you can sacrifice this creature to give your entire board indestructible until the end of turn, functioning as an early body you can swing with, while also just preventing your opponents from casting any sort of board wipe because you can just sacrifice this creature in response. Spectacular Tactics, a 2 mana instant speed spell that will allow us to pick one out of its 2 options. The first option will allow us to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control and it will gain hexproof until the end of turn, both allowing us to scale up our commander and protecting her from any sort of targeted removal. And the second option allows us to destroy any creature on the battlefield with power 4 or greater. A very versatile 2 mana card you can use both offensively and defensively. Collective Effort. The first option acts as a removal tool, allowing you to destroy any creature with power 4 or greater like the previous card. The second option allows you to deal with any enchantment on the battlefield. And the third option allows you to put a +1/+1 counter on your entire board. Now obviously all of the options on this card are just incredible for this deck. And the best part is that this card also has the Escalate mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast a spell we can tap any amount of untapped creatures we control, and for each creature we did tap this way we get to pick an additional mode. Now since we will always have some spare gnomes on the battlefield, we will usually be able to get all 3 of these fantastic effects for just 3 mana, making this into an incredibly valuable card. Unbreakable Formation, a protection spell that will give our entire board indestructible until the end of turn, and if we do cast a spell during our main phase we also get to put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures and they will gain vigilance until the end of turn. Another spell you can both use defensively against board wipes, or whenever you do have a bunch of gnomes on the field you can use this effect to just double their power and go for a lethal swing. Wear and Tear, a dual-sided fuse card that the left side will allow you to destroy an artifact and the right side will allow you to destroy an enchantment on instant speed. And thanks to the fuse mechanic, if you do pay the total 3 mana cost you actually get to activate both of its effects. Now while this card might look really simple, nothing is as annoying as there being a Rhystic Study on the battlefield and no one at the table being able to deal with it. Nowadays in modern day Magic almost any deck is playing these incredibly valuable artifacts and enchantments. And usually whenever the table is unable to deal with them, they will just take over the game all by themselves. Play your removal, people. Will of the Mardu. The first option will allow us to generate X 1/1 warrior tokens, X being the amount of creatures target player controls, which obviously we will be using on ourselves because we are a token deck, and it will just allow us to double up on our board state, which by the way can really surprise your opponents if you do have an impact tremors and tank creatures on the battlefield. And the second option will deal damage to target creature equal to the amount of creatures you do control, which since we will always control a huge amount of tokens will allow us to remove any creature on the field. And the best part about this card is that whenever we do control our commander, we get to pick both options at once, which will first generate us a gazillion tokens and then allow us to ping a bazillion damage to a specific target creature. And the last card in this section, and one I'm currently still testing out, is Leonardo's Technique, a 4-mana spell that will allow us to pick 2 creatures in our graveyard with mana value 3 or less and just straight return them to the battlefield. Now the main reason I am testing out this card is due to the sneak mechanic, which will allow us to cast this card for just 2 mana by returning an unblocked attacker to our hand. Now usually if you are swinging 5 of your gnomes at your opponents, at least one of them will go through, which will then turn this spell into one of the most efficient reanimation cards out there. You can use it to get back any valuable creature that you lost over the course of the game, and even whenever your commander does get destroyed, instead of making it go to the command zone, you can just put it into your graveyard, and then you can use this card to get it back on the field, bypassing any sort of commander decks. Next up we have the lands. Now since this deck is built on a €100 budget, we really aren't using anything fancy, but we do run a couple of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those. Castle Emberat. For 3 mana and tapping this land, we can give all creatures we control +1 power until the end of turn. And in the late game, this can be a really impactful ability, because whenever you do have 10 gnomes on the battlefield, you can just use this land, double their power, and instead of just dealing their 10 combat damage, they will now deal 20. Minas Tirith, a legendary land you can pay 2 mana and tap to draw a card, but you can only activate this ability if 2 or more creatures attack this turn. A simple but solid ability on a land that will give us additional draw in the late game. Just keep in mind you do have to have declared attacks with 2 creatures. The gnomes entering tapped and attacking won't actually count towards this effect. Restless Bivouac, a land that for 3 mana you can animate into a 2/2 creature, that whenever it attacks will allow you to put 1 counter on any creature you control. Now while this isn't the most impactful ability by any means, it is a really nice subtle way to get an additional counter and additional token generation of your commander. Tyrite Sanctum. For 2 mana and tapping it, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control, and it will become a god in addition to its other types, giving us a nice ability on a land to get additional counters on our commander. And for 4 mana and sacrificing this land, we get to put an indestructible counter on target god we control. Now I'm gonna be honest, I've never been able to use this part of the card while playing this deck, but I suppose in some niche late game situations you can use it to make your commander indestructible. And for the regular mana producing lands, we're playing a Pain land, an Opal Palace, a Check land, a Command Tower, a Reveal land, 2 Filter lands, a Fast land, a Tango land, a Horizon land, a Scry land, and for basics we're playing 12 plains and 8 mountains. And finally we have the upgrade section. If you want to push our gnome generating girl to her absolute limits, this is where things get really interesting. These are the cards that will turn Anim from a strong budget commander into a fully optimized powerhouse. If you want a detailed list of all the specific card swaps you can make for these upgrades, just head over to the Moxfield Decklist, click on the primer button, and you'll find the entire list over there. Let's start off with the most obvious upgrade. Esper Sentinel, arguably the strongest white card in the entire format. It's a 1-drop creature that whenever any of your opponents cast a non-creature spell will give them the option to pay X mana, X being equal to the power of your Esper Sentinel, and if they don't, you get to draw a card. Now I can guarantee you, if you are able to get this card on the battlefield on turn 1, you are going to have a great time, because whenever your opponents now play an acceleration spell, a mana rock, any sort of interaction, you will get to draw a card. And usually during the early turns of the game, this card will be drawing you like 2 to 3 additional cards per turn cycle. Now I'm gonna be honest and share a really unpopular opinion. I really do think that Esper Sentinel should be banned in the format. Because if you are playing a deck that's in white colors, you just have to play this card no matter what deck you are playing. The Ozolith, a 1 mana legendary artifact that whenever any creature with a counter on it would leave the battlefield, will just take those counters and put it on itself. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if any counters are on the Ozolith, you get the option to move them onto any target creature. Now this simple 1 mana card does give us an additional layer of protection and some sort of a get out of jail for free card if Anim gets removed. Because let's say you did spend a couple of turns getting Anim up to like 5 counters, usually whenever she then is removed you have to cast her again and start the process all over again, and the tempo of this deck really slows down. But whenever you do have an Ozolith on the battlefield, when this happens, none of those problems will remain true. You can just recast your commander, put all of the counters on her again, swing with any creature, and you will be generating huge amounts of gnomes again. Charismatic Conqueror, a 2 mana vampire that whenever any artifact or creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control will give them a decision. Either they make that card enter the battlefield tapped, or you get to generate a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. And no matter what your opponents do decide to choose, it will always give you value. Either their creatures will enter tapped and they won't have any blockers for whatever creature you are swinging with, or this card will just generate you an absurd amount of additional creature tokens. Downstruce, a 2 mana spell that will give both you and all permanents you control hexproof until the end of turn. And it also has the gift mechanic, meaning whenever you cast this, you get the option to make an opponent draw a card. When you do, all your permanents will also gain indestructible until the end of turn. And this is just a straight upgrade over the protection spells we are playing in our main board, like an Unbreakable Formation, because it will give both hexproof and indestructible, allowing you to deal with wipes and targeted exile based removal, and it does apply to all your permanents, not just your creatures. So you can even use this effect to protect your impact tremors from being removed by any sort of enchantment removal. Generous Plunderer, a 2 mana menace creature that at the beginning of your upkeep will generate you a treasure token, but in return one of your opponents will also get to generate a treasure. And this card is just a straight upgrade over the simple mana dorks we are playing, because it also has the same function that we can swing with it on turn 3 to start generating Anim triggers, and you can just stockpile the treasures for a big turn where you are going for the game win. And on top of that, this creature also has a really solid attack trigger. Whenever it attacks, it will deal damage to the defending player equal to the amount of artifacts that player controls. Now most decks on average will have like 3 artifacts on the battlefield, giving you a little bit of additional damage. But this card is the absolute nightmare of any sort of artifact based deck. I've had games where I attacked with this card and its ability did a whopping 20 damage to the defending player, which is absolutely crazy. And another upgrade that's just a straight upgrade to our acceleration pieces is Tataru Taru. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you and an opponent will get to draw a card, making this card function as some sort of a cantrip, already replacing itself and also triggering its second ability. Whenever an opponent draws a card and it's not their turn, you get to generate a tapped treasure token. This ability will only trigger once per turn, so this card will both give you a turn 2 body to swing with, it will replace itself, it will accelerate your mana, and if it does stick to the battlefield and opponents are drawing cards, it will provide you with even more value. Voice of Victory, the new and improved version of a Grand Abolisher, and it has a really similar ability. Opponents won't be able to cast spells during your turn, and this effect is way more impactful than it sounds, because whenever it's now your turn, your opponents won't be able to use any sort of counter magic, they won't be able to use instant speed spot removal, and you will just be able to do your thing without ever having having to worry about being disrupted. Now the reason this card is a better version of Grand Abolisher is the fact that it has the Mobilize 2 mechanic, meaning whenever it attacks you get to generate 2 tapped and attacking red warrior tokens that will get exiled at the end of your turn, which in this deck is a really nice way to get some additional group slug triggers. Caretaker's Talent, a 3-mana class card that whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control will draw you a card, already providing the exact same value as a Tokazia's Welcome. But on top of that, this card also has 2 additional levels. By paying 1 white mana, it goes to its 2nd level and you get to create a token copy of any token you already control. And where the real money's at is its last stage, which you can get to for 4 additional mana, which is just a really brutal anthem effect that will give a +2/+2 stat boost to any creature token you control, just tripling up on all of the combat damage that our gnomes will be doing. A fantastic draw engine that also can function as a win con in the late game. Delny, Streetwise Lookout. Passively, creatures we control with power 2 or less can be blocked by any creature with power 3 or greater, which is more relevant than you'd imagine to actually give our gnomes some sort of a pseudo unblockable effect. But the ability that Delny is most known for is that whenever any ability of a creature with power 2 or less would trigger, we will get an additional trigger of that. And let me just give you a couple of examples of how potent this effect can be. Your Rosy Cotton will now generate you double the amount of +1/+1 counters whenever a token enters. All of your group slug creatures like a Negate Instigator will now deal double the amount of damage to the entire table, and you will gain double the amount of life of your Halia and even draw 2 cards per turn. It's just a really efficient card that helps in combat with your gnomes and will give you additional value out of all of your triggers. Fated Firepower. For 3 red mana plus X you get an enchantment that will enter the battlefield with X fire counters on it. And then if any source you control would deal damage to either an opponent or a permanent they control, it will deal that much damage plus X, X being the amount of fire counters on this enchantment. And let me tell you, this card is just absolutely brutal, because this deck deals damage in small increments of 1 damage by either swinging with our 1 power gnomes or dealing 1 damage with our group slug cards. Even casting this card with just 1 fire counter will double all the damage you already deal in this deck, let alone whenever you get to the late game and are able to pump even more mana into the X. And my favorite part about this card is the fact that it has the flash mechanic, meaning you can just swing everything at your opponents, and even though they did their calculations and they do think they are fine, you can then just flash in this enchantment and just surprise them and take them out of the game. General Creed, the Bolt Bringer, a 3-drop creature that has an Impact Tremors effect attached to itself, and whenever 1 or more goblins you control do attack, it will generate you a 1/1 goblin token. Now I'm gonna be honest, this card only gives you a slight benefit and you don't really need it in the deck, but whenever you compare it to a Witty Roast Master, it is a strictly better card. Flawless Maneuver, a 3-mana spell that will give all creatures we control indestructible until the end of turn. But if we do have our commander on the battlefield, we get to cast this spell for absolutely free. And since the entire point of this deck is having our commander on the battlefield, this card is just perfect. You can just tap out all of your mana, put your entire hand on the table, and even if your opponents think you have no interaction available because you are tapped out, you can still use this card for free. And now that we're talking about free protection spells, we also play a Clever Concealment, which will allow us to phase out any number of non-land permanents we control. And phasing out basically means those cards won't exist until our next upkeep. But fun fact, when creatures phase back in and they had any sort of +1/+1 counters on them, they will just retain the counters, which is just perfect for our commander. And what makes this card incredible for any creature-based deck is the fact that it has the Convoke mechanic, meaning we can tap our creatures to pay for the mana cost, and just like a Flawless Maneuver, usually we will be able to cast it for free. Knuckles the Echidna, a 4-mana creature with double strike, trample, and haste, that also passively has exactly the same effect as a professional phase breaker. Whenever 1 or more creatures do deal combat damage to an opponent, you get to generate a treasure token. And on top of that, it also has a passive ability that can act as some sort of an alternate win con, because at the beginning of your upkeep, if you do control 30 or more artifacts, you just instantly win the game, which in this deck is something that might actually happen because all of the gnomes will be generating are also artifacts. And this card is just a straight upgrade over Professional Phase Breaker, because the fact that it costs 4 mana isn't actually that big of a deal, because on turn 3 we will never be casting our Phase Breaker anyways. We will always be casting Anim, and cards that cost 2 or 4 mana are actually way more relevant. Mondrak, Glory Dominus, a 4 mana creature that whenever any token would be created under our control will allow us to generate double the amount of tokens instead, which will give us double the board presence with our gnome tokens, double the impact tremors triggers, and it will even double up on our treasure producing cards. Now that in itself is more than enough reason to include Mondrak in the deck, but on top of that it also has a really solid activated ability. For 1 generic mana, 2 white for action mana, and sacrificing 2 creatures or artifacts, we get to put an indestructibility counter onto Mondrak. And since we will always have a huge amount of gnomes to sacrifice to this effect, it is a token doubling engine that is incredibly hard to get off the board by your opponents. Of course, we're also playing the strongest impact tremors effect out there, Purphoros, God of the Forge. It's a 4 mana indestructible enchantment that will deal 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield. And just like I explained when I was talking about Slash, the amount of damage this card can cause is just insane. And the fact that it is both indestructible and it is an enchantment makes it incredibly hard to get off the board by your opponents. And Purphoros doesn't stop there, because he also has an activated ability. For 3 mana, you get to give your creatures fire breathing, which on top of all of the group slug damage he'll already be doing is a really nice way to just buff up your gnomes and also increase the amount of combat damage they will deal. Roaming Throne. Whenever this creature enters the battlefield, we have to name a creature type, and this time we won't be naming gnomes. Instead, we will be naming human, because this card will then allow us to double up on Anim's trigger, giving us additional counters and more than doubling the amount of gnomes we'll produce, while also scaling incredibly well with other humans in the deck, like Sarah Leon's, a Reckless Fire Weaver, or Professional Phase Breaker, and even something as simple as a Knight of the White Orchid. And the last and the most beautiful card in this section is Elspeth Storm Slayer, a massive 5 mana planeswalker that has exactly the same passive effect as a Mondrak, just doubling up on any amount of tokens we produce. Double the gnomes, double the treasures, and even double the toys. And while that effect is already incredibly potent, she also has 3 really relevant loyalty abilities. The +1 ability will generate you a white soldier token, but will generate you 2 instead thanks to her passive ability, just adding to our board state and allowing us to get additional impact tremors triggers. The 0 ability will allow us to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and they will gain flying until our next turn, which will both buff up your Anim Pakal, double the power of all of your gnomes, and will give your entire board evasion until your next turn. And our -3 ability will allow you to pinpoint remove any creature with mana value 3 or greater, which is a perfect way to just remove any sort of problematic commander. Honestly, one of the strongest planeswalkers ever printed. And that's it for my in-depth Anim Pakal Thousandth Moon deck tech. A commander that on the surface looks very simple, but can really quickly scale out of control and generate you a massive board state. Every attack will make her stronger, every counter will increase your token generation, and before you know it, you will be flooding the board with tapped and attacking gnome creature tokens that instantly apply pressure. And the fact that she can do all of these things on just a €100 budget makes it even more impressive. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a gear emoji in the comments below. Share this video with every player at your local game store, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's upload. Thanks for watching, enjoy gnoming your opponents, and I will see you in the next one.